Her parents sold her for being infertile until a lonely Comanche with 5 children took her in. Cross Creek Border Market, Kansas Territory, late autumn, 1874. The wind carried dust through the open square, kicking up skirts and rustling the canvas roofs of merchant stalls. The sun, low and tired, bled orange across the dry horizon. In the center of it all, tied to a wooden post like a warning or a forgotten item, stood Eleanor Rose. Her father's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, sharp and deliberate. "She is barren, folks. Can't bear a child to save her life. But she can sew, she can cook, and she does not talk back. Half the price of a breeding cow." "Please, Papa," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Her wrists were chafed raw where the rope bit into her skin. Her cheeks, sunburned and stained with dried tears, flushed again with humiliation. "Shut your mouth," her father snapped. "Be grateful I am selling you where men can look you in the eye instead of tossing you to the pigs." A few people chuckled, most just looked away. Eleanor had once stood at the altar of St. John's Chapel, her hands trembling not from fear, but from hope. Her wedding dress had been hand-sewn by her mother. Her groom, the eldest son of a wealthy cattle baron, had looked at her like a prize calf. Their marriage had been arranged as a blessing for both families. She had been told she was chosen. For 2 years, she drank bitter roots prescribed by the midwife, counted days with trembling fingers, and prayed so hard her knees ached. But her womb never stirred. No blood turned blue, no swell of belly, no infant cries in the cold cabin air. Her mother-in-law had been the first to speak what others only whispered. "She is decoration, a useless flower. Let us not waste spring on fallow soil." Her husband stopped looking her in the eye, stopped speaking at all. Then, one evening, he rode home with a new girl, barely 16, with quick eyes and a smile like vinegar. He handed Eleanor a letter, unsigned, cold. "She will give me 5 sons, God willing," he said, not looking at her. "You cannot." They packed her things, what little she had, and left them by the door. She was not allowed to stay until sunrise. The girl had taken her room, her pillow, her place at the table. Eleanor walked 5 miles through dust and shame to reach her father's house. Her mother had passed years ago. Her father opened the door, looked at her face, and frowned. "You should have kept your womb working. That was your only job." She slept in the barn that night. By morning he had made up his mind. There were mouths to feed, debts to settle. A daughter who could not bear heirs was a burden, less than a mule, less than milk. So now she stood, in the middle of the market square, the rope around her wrists biting deeper every time she shifted to keep balance. Her dress, once white and stitched with hope, was torn and dust-stained. "Anyone?" her father called out again, voice hoarse with frustration. 22 years old, still got all her teeth, just faulty inside." The crowd murmured. A boy pointed and laughed. A woman shook her head. Eleanor stared ahead, eyes glassy. She did not cry. She could not. There was nothing left to squeeze from her. Her pride had been stripped in layers. At the doorstep of her husband, in the barn of her father, and now in front of strangers who would rather barter for chickens. The wind picked up again. It smelled of manure and rust and old hay, but Eleanor only smelled ash. Somewhere, a bell rang for supper. Somewhere else, a child was born to someone not her. She closed her eyes. The world did not stop, even as she was breaking. And still, no one stepped forward. Cross Creek Border Market, moments later. The laughter died first. Then the murmurs faded, swallowed by the hush that fell like a curtain across the square. Dust settled mid-air as hooves struck earth, slow, deliberate, and far too quiet for a group that large. Heads turned, conversations halted mid-sentence. A child dropped a stick of licorice. From the edge of the market they appeared like ghosts stepping from the trees, a small band of Comanche riders, their horses lean and dust-streaked from the trail. No one spoke, but the tension thickened like a storm about to break. At the front rode a man with shoulders broad as a barn beam, his chest bare beneath a faded deerskin vest. His hair, long and black, was tied neatly behind his head with a strip of red cloth. His face, weathered and solemn, held no anger, only weariness carved into the lines around his mouth and the shadow beneath his dark eyes. He was not alone. Behind him, 5 children rode single file on smaller ponies, some clinging to the reins, others to one another. The oldest, a boy of 10, held his chin high though his eyes darted with alertness. A girl about 8 rode beside him, silent, her face half hidden behind a shawl. The others were younger, their clothes mismatched and travel-stained. The smallest, a girl no older than 3, sat in front of her brother, clutching a corn-husked doll. No one in town moved. The man dismounted. Dust clung to his boots, the bottom of his leggings soaked in creek mud. He walked without hesitation toward the wooden table where Eleanor's father still stood, arms crossed, jaw tight with suspicion. Eleanor, bound at the post, blinked slowly. Her lips were cracked, her vision blurred, and yet when she saw the man, this stranger from the forest, flanked by wary children and silence, something deep inside her stirred. Not hope, not yet, but something less hollow than before. The man reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he drew a simple silver necklace, unpolished, but unmistakably handmade. A name was etched into the back in careful strokes. Naiva. He placed it gently on the table. "I will take her," he said in low, accented English. His voice was like old cedar, rough, but full of heat. "Not as a wife, as a soul that should not be chained." Eleanor's father frowned, scoffing. "What if she's no good for you either? You want a refund later?" The man's eyes did not waver. He tilted his head slightly, studying Eleanor for the first time, not her body, not her age, not her shame, just her, as if he saw something others had missed. "She is not a thing," he said simply. "I do not buy to own. I buy to free." The father hesitated, but the silver caught his eye. His hand hovered greedily, then closed around the necklace. "Your problem now." No one else moved. The square held its breath. Eleanor's throat tightened. Her knees buckled slightly. The rope was cut. She barely felt it. Her feet refused to move at first, too used to standing still. Her hands trembled. He did not reach for her. He did not speak to her. He just turned and began to walk. She looked to the dust where the necklace had lain. She looked at the man's back, broad and steady, the 5 children waiting beyond him like shadows of a life she could not imagine. And she stepped forward. Not because she trusted him. Not because she believed in second chances. But because he had looked at her and seen someone worth unchaining. Her father said nothing as she passed. The crowd had already begun to lose interest. But Eleanor, barefoot and bruised, followed the stranger out of the square toward the edge of the world. And for the first time in months, she was not being dragged. The ride was long and quiet, the kind that settled into the bones. Eleanor sat stiffly in the mule cart, her hands clasped, the wooden slats pressing against her back with each jolt. The children followed behind on small ponies, silent and watchful, their eyes wide but unreadable. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the sun had vanished behind the ridge, leaving a streak of rose over the trees. Pines rose thick and ancient, casting long shadows as a nearby creek whispered under stone. The land felt different, not soft but steady, not cruel but uncompromising. Tocho led her through a clearing where a single lodge stood, built of pine logs and hide, its roof patched with care. Smoke spiraled thin from the chimney. A wind chime made of bone and beads swayed lazily above the doorway. This was her space, he said, nodding toward the entrance. He did not explain who her was. He did not need to. Eleanor stepped inside and stopped. The air smelled of cedar, faint lavender, and ash. The room was small, a cot in the corner, a fire pit, a rolled mat, no mirrors, no dresses. But the walls were marked with carvings and etchings, symbols and patterns that told stories of someone else's hands, someone else's life. 5 children stood just outside, peering in. The eldest boy stood still, arms crossed. The second glanced at her and looked away. The girl clutched her brother's sleeve, and the youngest twins, barely past toddlerhood, clung to each other, their expressions wary. No one spoke. Tocho knelt near the fire and added a log. "This is Eleanor," he said simply. "She stays here now." He looked at the children, not asking, only informing. Then he turned and left. Eleanor sat on the cot, unsure what to do. No one gave instructions, no one asked anything of her. She listened to footsteps outside, soft giggles, an owl calling in the dark. Her fingers ached. She stared at the pale line on her ring finger, now nearly gone. Sleep came late and shallow, broken by dreams of doors slamming, voices shouting, and children crying, far from her reach. On the 3rd night she finally rose. The fire had burned low. The children were curled together near their hearth, small bodies warmed by each other. Eleanor moved instinctively, sorting leftover beans, drawing water from the well, lighting a fresh fire. Her hands worked without instruction, not for praise, just to feel useful. Then came a cough, sharp, wet, alarming. She turned. The youngest boy lay curled, his brow shining with sweat, breath ragged. She knelt, felt the heat radiating from his skin. Her chest tightened. No one stirred. She stood, searching shelves, until she found a cracked bowl, some dried herbs, a bundle tied with hide string. She did not know their names, but she had used similar ones before. She crushed them, added water, and placed the pot over the fire. The boil took forever. Her hands shook. When it cooled, she spooned it gently to the boy's lips. He coughed, but drank. She wiped his brow with a cloth. Her hands never stopped moving. Outside she heard something shift. A soft rustle. Then quiet. At the doorway, resting on the threshold, lay a green sprig, tied with horsehair. Tocho had not spoken, but he had seen. No words. Just the offering. By dawn, the fever had broken. The boy opened his eyes, blinked once, and fell back asleep. Later, the other children looked at her differently. Not with full trust. Not yet. But with something else. Something quiet and new. And for now, that was enough. The days fell into rhythm, not soft but steady. Eleanor woke with the sun and fed the fire before the chill left the air. She swept out the lodge with a branch broom, gathered herbs from the edges of the trees, and learned to boil corn until the smell reminded her of childhood and church days, and something almost like comfort. The children did not speak much, but they watched everything. At first from a distance, then from doorways, then from just over her shoulder. Eleanor, unsure how to win affection when words felt like bruises in her mouth, turned to what she knew. Quiet hands, steady tasks, small acts of care. She braided the girl's hair when it tangled. She patched a rip in the older boy's tunic. She left berries by the twins' bedding, sour and red, but sweetened when dipped in honey. One afternoon, while gathering willow bark near the stream, she showed the 6-year-old girl how to fold wide leaves into little boats. The girl's brow furrowed in concentration, her tongue sticking out as she mirrored Eleanor's movements. When the leaf boat floated down the creek and the girl smiled, really smiled, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, something deep and sore and still alive. They began to follow her more closely after that. She told them stories, nothing grand, just tales from her mother. Animals that could talk, stars that fell in love with the moon, a fox that stole a wedding dress. The younger ones leaned in, eyes wide. The oldest boy pretended not to listen, but Eleanor caught him once, after dark, repeating one of her stories to the goats. Tocho did not interfere. He came and went like the wind, quiet, always watching, always listening. Sometimes he brought home roots or salted meat. Sometimes he brought silence. He never touched her, never asked anything, but he always nodded to her as he passed, and sometimes she thought she saw the edges of a smile behind his tired eyes. She did not know if that made it better or worse. Then came the stew. She had meant well. The fire had burned too hot, and the pot too full. A careless bump of her hip and the entire thing crashed to the ground. Hot broth, soft beans, tender roots, all of it splattered across the floor. The children froze. Eleanor stood above the mess, paralyzed, heart pounding. She could already feel the slap, the scream, the shame pressing in. It had happened before, back when she burned bread in her husband's house. Back when she was less wife, more disappointment. Her hands shook, her knees buckled. And then, it is only stew. Tocho's voice came from behind her, quiet and plain. She turned. He knelt without expression, scooping vegetables back into the pot. His movements were calm, unhurried. He did not look at her. He did not scold. "It can be made again," he added, wiping his hands on a cloth. "We all spill." Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him, helping clean in silence, blinking hard. She did not cry, not then. Not until later, when the children were asleep and she was alone by the hearth, the faint scent of beans still clinging to the air. She thought of her wedding day, of her mother-in-law's face twisted in disgust, of how many times she had apologized for being less than expected. And she thought of 5 pairs of eyes watching her, not judging, just witnessing. That night, the youngest twin coughed. Eleanor stirred, reached for the damp cloth by the fire, and padded barefoot to the sleeping pile. She touched the child's brow, warm but not alarming, just a passing chill. She tucked the quilt tighter, hummed low beneath her breath. The boy murmured something in Comanche, soft, unclear. Eleanor leaned closer. "What was that, sweetheart?" His tiny hand patted hers. "Ina," he whispered. The word landed like a stone in water. Ina. She had heard it before, spoken between siblings, murmured in lullabies. It meant mother, not nursemaid, not stranger, not woman who helped. Mother. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She sat there for a long while, the child's fingers curled around hers, her other hand pressed to her chest as if to steady it. She was not their blood, not their history. But in that moment, she was something more real. She kissed the boy's forehead, then sat up slowly and looked around at the other sleeping forms. The girl with the knotted braid, the middle boy who snored through storms, the eldest who always faced the door. all of them breathing evenly, bodies warm beneath wool and hide. Not one had come from her womb, but every single one had started to grow beneath her hands. Outside, the trees whispered. Inside, her heart whispered back. The sun hung high over the trading post when Tocho tied his horse to the hitch rail and turned to Eleanor. It was market day, noisy, hot, and thick with dust, but they needed salt, bandages, and flour. He had asked her if she wanted to come. He never ordered, never assumed, just asked. She had said yes. They walked side by side, not touching, but not apart. Eleanor wore a plain brown dress, her braid tucked under a scarf, and the woven basket Tocho had given her swung from her elbow. She felt steadier than she had in months. Not safe exactly, but more like herself. Children ran past with sticks and shrieks. Women bartered loudly near the spice stall, the smell of tanned hides mixed with frying lard in the breeze. It was loud but familiar. She began to relax. Until she heard the voice. Well, look what the wind dragged back. Eleanor turned slowly. Standing near the dry goods counter, shaded by a paper parasol, was her former mother-in-law, still wrapped in fine lace and bitterness. At her side stood a younger woman in a cornflower dress, belly slightly rounded, gloved fingers resting atop it with calculated grace. The air shifted. The older woman stepped forward, voice sharp enough to peel bark. I thought I recognized that hunched little neck. Mabel? No. Eleanor? She clicked her tongue. Hard to tell from the dirt and rags. The younger woman giggled, her gaze traveling down Eleanor's dress, her rough hands, her basket. That's her? She asked, loudly enough for nearby vendors to hear. The one who couldn't even produce a squalling pup? Yes, the elder snapped. Pretty but cursed, useless as a cracked jar. We gave her everything and she gave us nothing. Eleanor's throat burned. She did not speak, her feet rooted to the ground. People were staring now, merchants, shoppers, a man chewing tobacco. Whispers tickled her ears like nettles. She clenched the basket tighter, held her chin high. She would not cry. She had cried enough for a lifetime. Then she felt a shadow step beside her. Tocho. He had soil on his sleeves, dirt beneath his fingernails. His boots were still damp from the river crossing. He did not speak at first, just stood there, tall and still, his presence quiet but unmovable. Then, in a voice that cut through every murmur, he said, She is the only one who made my daughter smile after her mother died. The crowd stilled. Eleanor's breath caught. Tocho's gaze did not shift. His words were not defensive, they were simple, like truths carved in stone. She knows how to hold fevered children through the night. She hums lullabies in a language not her own. She remembers birthdays no one told her. He turned to the women. That is worth more than sons who come from a woman's belly, but never her heart. Neither woman replied. The elder's face flushed crimson. The younger looked suddenly smaller. Tocho turned, gently touched Eleanor's elbow, not to pull her away but to ask her, quietly, if she was ready to leave. She nodded, unable to find her voice. They walked from the square without another word. No one followed. No one dared. It was not until they reached the edge of the woods, their boots finally quiet on pine needles, that Eleanor's hands began to tremble. She stopped, turned to him, eyes glassy. No one's ever stood up for me like that, she whispered. Tocho did not speak. He simply looked at her, deeply, evenly, and then nodded once. That night, when the children were asleep and the fire cast shadows on the lodge walls, Eleanor sat alone outside. In her lap lay a small wildflower she had picked near the stream. She did not know what it was called, but it was yellow, stubborn, and had bloomed in a place most thought barren. She twirled it in her fingers, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, not from shame, not from fear, and from being defended, from being seen, from knowing, finally, that someone had chosen to stand beside her, not because they had to, but because they believed she was worth it. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain, the morning they came. 3 riders, clean boots and polished rifles, approached the edge of the Comanche settlement with stiff backs and entitlement clinging to them like perfume. One of them wore a red kerchief at his throat, the same one Eleanor's father had worn when he tied her wrists to the market post. The fourth, slower on horseback, was her former husband. They brought papers, stamped, signed, witnessed by the county judge and the preacher in town. A legal document declaring ownership, notarized during the transaction months before. They had come to collect her. Tocho stood between them and the lodge, arms crossed, shoulders still. His children hid behind the door flap, wide-eyed. Eleanor stood at the threshold, a woven basket still in her hand, a piece of bread half cut on the table inside. She had not known what danger looked like until it wore the face of the man who once kissed her with promises. She was sold legally, her father barked. She's our blood. We decide where she goes. The man with the kerchief added, "The Comanche have no right to keep a white woman. You'll bring the army down on your heads if you don't comply." Tocho's voice was low but firm. "She is not owned. Not here." The riders sneered. "We'll see what the cavalry says about that." Later that night, the tribal council met. Quiet voices filled the circle like smoke. The elders were clear. Conflict with the white towns could mean blood. They had lost too many. They could not risk more. Tocho said nothing. Eleanor sat outside, hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to the verdict like a child awaiting punishment. She was to leave by morning. They told her it was for safety, for peace. She knew it was for survival. She was placed in a separate lean-to, guarded lightly as per the agreement. Her hands were not bound. But the message was clear: do not resist, do not run. The children screamed when they heard. Little Ben cried so hard he made himself sick. The girl clung to Eleanor's leg until the elders pulled her away. Eleanor sat in silence, eyes dry. There was no dignity left to lose. Until the moon rose. Until the wind shifted. Until she remembered that she was no longer a name on a paper, no longer a trade item on a dusty table, no longer someone whose value could be counted in coins or signatures. She stood, walked to the fire pit where a broken shard of pottery lay, and picked it up. Inside the lean-to, she pulled the string from her braid, let her hair fall loose, golden, sun-streaked, the color that had once been called her only worth. She held the shard tightly, drew it up to her temple, and cut. Strands fell like silk to the ground. She kept cutting, until her neck was bare, until her scalp stung, until the mirror in her mind no longer reflected the girl who begged to be kept. Then, barefoot and silent, she stepped into the dark. No one saw her go. But the stars did. She reached the edge of the settlement, past the goats, past the sleeping dogs, past the place where the children had built leaf boats. She reached the lodge, hers and not hers, and opened the flap. Tocho sat inside, knees drawn, eyes closed. He opened them slowly when she entered. She said nothing at first. He looked at her hair, at her face, at the defiance in the way she stood. "I am not going back," she said. His jaw tensed. "They will come. I know. You might be killed." She nodded. "So be it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" She stepped closer. "Because they bought me with blood," she whispered. "But I will redeem myself with love." He stood. He reached out, hesitated, then placed a hand gently over her heart. It beat steady, not frantic, not afraid. She was not a wife, not a prisoner, not a possession. She was a woman who had chosen her own name, and for the first time it echoed not in pain, but in power. The weeks that followed were quieter, but fuller. No soldiers came, no angry fathers, no husbands with claims. Perhaps the paper had burned, perhaps shame had kept them away, or perhaps they had realized what Eleanor had already learned, that what lives in the heart cannot be repossessed. The children returned to her like tide to shore. The youngest no longer cried when she stepped out of sight. The girl brought her pine cones as gifts. The second boy sat beside her at meals instead of across the room. Even the eldest, stoic and skeptical, started to nod when she spoke. And slowly, they gave her a new name. Not just Ina Rose. She had not asked for it, had not expected it. But one morning, the middle boy woke from a feverish sleep, turned to her and whispered it like a prayer. "Ina Rose." Mother Rose? Not for flowers, but for the thorn strength she had quietly built around them, for the warmth, for the constancy. She began to teach them letters, using charcoal on worn bark and smooth stones. She drew shapes in the dust, humming softly as she wrote. She showed them how to spell their names, then gently added her own beneath them. Rose. It was the first time she had written it like that. Not as a surname, not as a remnant, but as something whole. Eleanor also taught them songs. Soft hymns her mother once sang while folding laundry, ballads she barely remembered, lullabies in both English and halting Comanche. The children listened, then joined in, and the forest seemed to lean in to hear. Tocho never interrupted. He would sometimes stand in the doorway, arms folded, listening with a stillness so deep it seemed sacred. Other times he left small gifts beside her work, a new quill made from hawk feather, a jar of berries, a stone smoothed by the river. One crisp morning, Eleanor accompanied Tocho and the eldest boy, Tama, to the schoolhouse on the edge of a nearby town. A teacher from the east had arrived, offering to register children for learning, regardless of tribe, so long as they spoke some English. Tama was nervous, his hand gripping hers tightly as they stepped into the small room with its creaky floorboards and chalk-scratched walls. The teacher, a tall man with gold-rimmed glasses, welcomed them with a practiced smile. "Name of the child?" he asked, pen poised. Tama, the boy said. Full name? The boy hesitated, then looked at Eleanor. He gave him a gentle nod. Tamarose Tocho, he said. The teacher blinked. And your mother's name? There was a pause. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but Tama beat her to it. Eleanor Tucho, he said clearly, because that is the name I call her from my heart. The teacher stared at the boy, then at her, then simply nodded and wrote it down. No further questions. They walked back through the trees in silence, the boy swinging her hand. The forest seemed brighter, the wind less biting, and though she did not cry, Eleanor's chest ached in the best possible way. That night she sat by the fire and wrote the name on a piece of bark, Eleanor Tocho. It was not given by law, nor by birth, but by love. And it was hers. The sky cracked, but never wept. The sun hung over the land like judgment, day after day, draining rivers to ribbons and turning soil to dust. Trees stood brittle, their leaves curled like parchment. The corn died first, then the beans, then the wildflowers Eleanor had coaxed from the garden's edge. The drought settled in like grief. But Eleanor rose before dawn each morning. She filled pots, buckets, and tin cans with water from the deep well. Her hands blistered, her back aching. Still, she tended the garden plant by plant, speaking softly to them as if they were frightened children. She sang lullabies, once used for fevered children, her voice steady in the silence. The garden did not bloom, but it did not die. Not while she loved it. Tocho watched from the porch, more tired now, moving slower. Dust hung in his shoulders, in his steps. He worked harder on less food, and even strong men wilt under too much sun. One evening, Eleanor found him collapsed near the woodshed. His skin burned under her touch. Just tired, he murmured, but she saw the truth in his eyes. She did not sleep for 2 nights. She brewed herbs, wiped sweat from his face, held him through the shivers. Spoon by spoon she fed him broth, whispering through his curses, her hands tireless. "Do not leave me," he said once in a fevered daze. "I will not," she whispered back. "Not now, not here." When he woke, the light was soft. He blinked at her tangled hair, her tired eyes. "You look like hell," he rasped. She smiled. "You should see yourself." That same day, the first green shoot broke through the garden's cracked soil. A week later, a yellow bloom appeared near the fence. Then, another. And another. The children called it a miracle. Eleanor called it grace. Tocho stood beside her, watching a tomato cling to its vine like a promise. "How?" he asked quietly. "You taught me not everything worth keeping comes easy." He nodded, took her hand and kissed each knuckle, gently, with reverence. That evening, they drove a wooden sign into the earth at the garden's edge. Not for sale. Not the land. Not the home. Not the love grown in dust and held together with hands. Years passed. The children grew, married, came back with little ones of their own. Grandchildren raced barefoot through rows Eleanor had once watered with a spoon. They called her Inner Rose. When they scraped knees or feared thunder, they found her arms without question. Tocho aged like oak, slow, quiet, solid. He carved toys, built benches, spoke little, and listened much. When asked how he knew Eleanor was the one, he always said the same thing: she stayed. One crisp morning she sat beside him on the porch, their fingers laced together. "I was once told I was worthless because I could not carry blood," she said softly. He looked at her, eyes warm. "You carried a home, a family, a man who did not know how to begin until you." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I was not the start of your bloodline." "No," he whispered. "But you were where I ended, in peace." When Eleanor passed, they buried her beneath the tree in the garden, where wind chimes still whispered her songs. Tocho carved her stone himself. She did not birth us, but she raised all that we became. He sat by her grave every morning, until one morning he did not come. They buried him beside her. The garden never stopped blooming. Even in the driest years, it remembered her hands. Travelers still pass the old fence and see the faded sign. Not for sale, because some things are too deeply loved to be owned. And love, once rooted, grows forever. If this story stirred something quiet and true in your heart, if Eleanor's strength reminded you that love is not measured by blood, but by how fiercely we choose to stay, then you are exactly where you belong. At Wild West Love Stories, we bring you tales of grit, grace, and devotion in the untamed heart of frontier America. Stories where bullets missed, but hearts didn't. Where women like Eleanor weren't just survivors, they were the soul of a home that didn't exist until they built it. So if you believe in love that grows through drought, in families formed by choice, not just birth, and in the kind of stories that make you cry softly and smile even softer. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and ride with us into the wild. Because out here, love is never easy, but it is always worth it.